This podcast is brought to you by the team at New Zealand Trucking Magazine. Remember to get your hands on the latest issue from your favourite retailer or subscribe now at nztrucking.co.nz.
Keep on Moving, the official podcast of New Zealand Trucking Media.
One of the legends of the transport industry, Warwick Johnson, has just celebrated his 90th birthday. We did a long-form interview with him as part of a podcast last year. We thought we'd go back to that to celebrate. Here he is, Warwick Johnson and Dave McCoy.
Here we are with Warwick Johnson. The book is called Prime Mover, The Remarkable Life of Warwick Johnson. For any self-respecting New Zealand truck buff, the name Warwick Johnson will need no explanation. A true pioneer of New Zealand's modern road transport history with a slant on building transportation, obviously. His contact list is a who's who of those who were the cornerstones of both trucking and trailer building in our country. His own contribution extends well beyond that of merely transporting buildings and over-dimensional loads. His life has been one that is truly a boy's own adventure annual. Warwick Johnson, thank you so much for having us in your home today and for giving us a couple of hours.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely day today. It's not raining and it's a real house removal day today. It's only Friday, so that's all right.
I want to start the chat with, I want to read the first paragraph of the dedication right at the start of the book. It says, "First and foremost, this book is for all of the men and women who shared my life, work and adventures. You could say we collectively took the bull by the horns and lived for the day-to-day challenges. In our final years, our bones may creak and groan, but those memories endure forever." And then opposing that is a photograph of Warwick and his dad. And
Carrying my share.
And the caption says, "My father instilled in me the importance of carrying my share of the load." And so we start in 1933 with Dad Bert and Mum Hazel, and you're on the Weldon away.
That's right. Yeah, I was only a young fella, of course, and I don't remember much until I was about 4 or 5. I know I had an injury when I was 4. I slid off the roof of a V8 car and the number plate pierced my eye. So I've been a one-eyed house removal guy all those years. Nobody ever knew that I had a bung eye, and I've still got a bung eye, but I don't tell people that. So that was really the start of things.
It's really interesting because your life's been punctuated at either end with pandemics and epidemics, because in your early life there was the polio and now we've got COVID, isn't it? So you've had pandemics at both ends of your life.
I saw so many things and changes, and I learnt that you had to learn. Practical experience was the best learning curve you could ever have. And when you see something that somebody else did that was wrong, you buried that in your head because you had to know that there was something better to be had. And I think that I took on board the fact that the stress was the biggest enemy in life. And I think at an early age, the stress level was something I left behind. I didn't bother with the stress. I always looked about for today and tomorrow. All my life, and people say, "Don't you worry about that?" I said, "No, there's nothing to worry about. That was yesterday." Yeah. And a fellow will ring up and say, "I've tipped a bloody house off." And I said, "Well, go and jack it back up again, put it back on." So it was no good crying over spilt milk, was it?
No, that's exactly right. And so your entry into house removals, even though it was a family business and Hazel's
I was the
dad
third generation, and my mother's father, old Pop Jack, started in 1886.
And he was hugely influential, wasn't he?
He came up the Waikato River on a paddle boat and jumped off that. And a chappie said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "Oh, I'm a carpenter." He said, "Are you any good at pulling down a shed?" So Pop did that. And that's sort of how the family went. And they had a very large piece of land in Hamilton East, about 7 or 8 acres, and that was where Pop built what's called the homestead, and that's where their yard was in McFarlane Street. So then we move on to the generation of my dad, and Dad's father was a station master for looking after the trains, and they built the railway lines, and Dad ran away from home when he was about 16 or 17 from Matamata, and the reason he left there, Dad said he was sick of crushing up and boiling the acorns for the pigs. So he cleared out and came to Hamilton and Pop, and these guys saw him leaning on a fence watching them shift the building, and they said to Dad that was he interested, he could have a bit of a job, but there'd be somewhere to sleep and a bit of kai, but there'd be no money. But Dad said, that'll do me. And believe it or not, after being there for a year or two, when I look at the history, he met the boss's daughter, which was my mother, and he married my mother. So that was Pop's daughter. My mother was Hazel, and a fantastic lady. A change came in our lives when he won a building society ballot, and there was an acre of land with a very big old villa house right in the middle of Hamilton East, and the £2,000 ballot that he got was sufficient to buy the acre and the 5-bedroom house, but it was terribly overgrown, and the people that owned it, their sons had gone overseas into the military, and of course for me, I suppose you could say that's where we started to learn how to light a fire, and we used to have horrendous fires and burning all the trees and rubbish, and many a day I'd singe my eyebrows and my hair, but that was at an early age. I was only maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think you learn the parables that you learn is something you never forget. My mother was an absolute saint. She was the in-between, my dad and her. If Dad was going to give me a hiding, Mum interfered. So she might have saved me the hiding. I used to say I had more hidings than hot dinners, but I was always in trouble doing something.
And your own entry into the world of the family business, the house removals, was a bit of literally a whirlwind, because you were on a farm when the tornado hit Hamilton.
What happened, the polio epidemic in 1947,
Yep.
and it closed our school. I was at primary school, and around about November, December, the school closed down, and as soon as I hit home, Mum said, you're going out onto a farm at Ruakahia, where they were friends of Mum and Dad. And believe it or not, of interest, that farm was right alongside the Ruakahia Aerodrome, where about 400 aircraft had come from the Pacific. And any spare minute I had, I used to sneak under the fence and jump in the planes and pretend to fly them. So that was about that. And then the bid came to go back to school, and around about February, March, April, the next year, I decided that I could probably go into the rural and be a farmer. And I wasn't interested. I had never even a thought of anything to do with building removals. By chance, it happened the day that I was leaning on a fence where I shouldn't have been, and the headmaster gave me 6 of the best. So I told him where I was going. I told him what I thought of him, and I didn't go back to school. I think I was only 13 or 14. I went home and told Mum I couldn't sit down. My ass was that sore. She put me onto a farm then at Matamata. So I spent 5 months of my time there until the 25th of August 1948, when the tornado roared through Frankton, Hamilton, and my dad was there shifting these mill houses that were sectional. 3 Arctic loads had just disappeared to Mamaku, and the only load they were standing in didn't tip over, but it smashed everything else. So Mum came and got me in the Model A, and that was my days of being a rural farmer. The old fella, Mr. Thirlwell, he said, boy, you pack your bag. Mum came in the Model A, and going home, I thought Mum was pretty nervous and tetchy, but I learned later that she'd never driven a car before. She never had a licence, and the Model A was a hard case thing anyhow. But so that was the 25th of August 1948. So you could say that was it.
That's where it all got started.
That's where it started. And I was as skinny as a rake, and but okay, I was okay. And the hardest part, I think, there, that I already knew so much. I probably knew more than the guys that Dad and his partner employed because of our previous years. Yeah.
And you had such great mentors and men to teach you.
Yeah, that was when in latter time, as I grew a bit older and I became more self-efficient, and the guys wouldn't listen to me because I was too young, and who the hell are you? What do you know about it? So I did have that problem.
Interesting. And of course, compulsory military training. You got called up to do your bit.
That was interesting. I was 18 years of age and turned 19, and of course it was the 8th intake, and we all had to go to Frankton, get in a train and go to Pepakura. So there were 4 carriages there, but one of the wags had disconnected the wagon, and when the train took off, it left us behind. So there was a bit of kerfuffle. But when we got to Pepakura, we had the daylight beaten out of us because somebody must have rung up and told them we were a bunch of rebels. It continued like that. We marched into a big hall for uniforms and sandpaper clothing, and I was walking across the bull ring. I didn't know you weren't allowed to walk on the bull ring, but diagonally I was going across the bull room, and the sergeant major, being a POM, he yelled out and told me I was on charge, and he told me to double away and pointed to his hut on the side. Little did he know I'd already shifted 100 of those damn things, and I knew very well what it was about. The door on the side and the windows on the other side, so I ran in that door and out through the window and kept the line of sight so he wouldn't know me out of 800 guys. So that was probably my day in the army.
But one thing I did pick up from the army years in the book was it didn't take long for them to put you in charge of men.
Yeah.
And so there's a natural leadership thing there going on.
I don't know how that happened, but there was 16 of us in our half share of the hut, and there was room for a separate bedroom, and they gave me the job as a hut superintendent or commander or whatever you call it. And the guys, of course, were all fresh off the turnips, and I said to them, look, you guys, we've got to just buckle in. We're here for 90 days, and we've just got to make the best of it. And I said, we've all paid tax. I said, let's get some of it back. And I said, we'll do something about it. You wait and see. So within days of being there, the superintendent, or the guy that run the army outfit, was Major Fowler, and he found out I was a house removal guy, and he pulled me to one side, and before I knew it, I had a Land Rover with multi-pots of food, and my job was to shift these particular buildings. So I would hand-pick my guys out of whatever, and of course we'd spend time shifting the buildings rather than going on bloody point duty.
And you taught guys to drive.
Yeah, well, because being 19, I'd been driving trucks since I was about 16. Dad got a Chev truck, brand new, around about that time, 47, 48. It was a 4-6-ton Chev. And Dad was used to the buggy, the horse and carts, and he was what I call a hopeless driver. So me being me, if I washed the truck and looked after it, I could drive it. So I did that. And one of the incidents happened that we were doing a job where we needed to go down to Roost Shipping and get sand. So I pulled under the hopper and filled the truck up with probably 3 or 4 metres of sand, pulled up alongside the office, and the manager his name was Jack Watts. What do you got there, boy? He said, leaning down, talking at it, and he wore big, thick glasses. I knew he was blind as a bat, but anyhow, I said, Jack, I think I've got about 3 yards, and a bit of a delay. He said, it doesn't look like 3 yards to me. If you say more like a yard, I said, you must be blind, you silly chook. Anyhow, the reason was that if he had to pay on his docket book for 3 yards, he had to pay royalty and tax for the sand that he dug out of the river. So by only having a metre or a yard, he only paid for the royalty for a yard. So the rest of that job, every time I turned up as a 16-year-old with a truck with 3 yards of sand, it was just another yard. So so I learned how to drive a truck when I was 16, 17, 18.
Yep.
When the time come for my traffic licence when I was 18, the local cop was Darby Finlayson from the Waikato County. Rang him up and I said, I really need to have a bit of time. I said, you better come out. So he came out to the yard and he pulled up in his beaten up old bloody county car. And I don't need to test you. He said, I've been seeing you for the last 2 years. So he just sat down and wrote out the ticket. He said, what do you want? And I said, well, I need a licence to drive that truck. So that's it.
That's how that's...
So of course, when I went into the army at 19, I was fully versed in how to drive a truck. I knew all about that sort of a thing. And of course, the other guys were all fellas off dairy farms and from wherever they came from, generally from the South Waikato. I suppose by realising that I knew what I was talking about, that it wasn't long before we were teaching these guys how to drive GMCs, how to change gears, and the GMCs actually were like brand new. They still had the fresh paint on them. They were beautiful trucks. So therefore, our 60-odd guys all got heavy traffic licences.
It set them up for life in many ways, didn't it?
Well, never thought about it at those times.
Yeah, exactly. So getting back into, so you've done that, you've done your 90 days for the Queen, and you're in the army, and you're back,
It was a hard case day. I was on point duty, and I was probably about 20 or maybe 21, but it was the day that the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen came to New Zealand for whatever reason, and I was on point duty at Ulster Street in Hamilton, and this Land Rover pulled up, and the driver said, "Oh, the Duke's here, he wants to talk to you. Any chance of a beer and a pea?" He said, "Oh, I have the pea first, but maybe the beer later." I said, "Well, okay, well, you jump in," he said. So I jumped in the Land Rover and took them down to our headquarters at Knox Street and up into the ramp into the building. And I said, "The toilet's down there, do you need a hand?" He said, "No, I can manage." Of course, when he emerged out of that, I said, "Well, the beer cabinet's locked up." But I said, "Well, break the padlock." But I said, "You've got a sign on the door that you've pinched a bloody bottle of beer." So he did that. So once he had his pea and his beer, we went back to him. He dropped me off at point duty, and he probably told the Queen where he'd been. I don't know what he said, but it was quite an introduction.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on. Before we go back, can you tell everyone about the flamethrower toilet?
Oh, yeah. Well, I suppose we take it back to the beginning of time with Mystery Creek Field Days, and I was part of the concern to provide a facility for, you could say, something visual and something active. They had a summer show and a winter show, which was everything was static and nothing moved, and we thought, well, we need to have something that jumps around and bulldozers and diggers and whatever, so that we could prove to the people. And that started with a group of people like myself. There was about 14 or 15 of us from various walks of life, and we formed a committee, and in that committee we were able to, I suppose, move on. We set up at Te Rapa was the first lot, and of course, knowing I shifted buildings, they said, well, we're going to need a building for the headquarters. So I didn't tell the education board, but I organised a school prefab, took it there on the trailer and put a few stays on the corner. And they said, well, we've got to have a bit of a landing because the royalty, they're going to come and she may want to say a few words. So we hastily put a shutter on a few posts and a bit of packing and stuck it there for and blow me down. She gets up on this balcony thing with no handrails, no nothing, and starts talking to the people. And you think of it today with health and safety, and it just wouldn't be like that. But so be it.
Yeah. So when you were in the army and you went away on a bush camp, and you made a special toilet so that the guys couldn't get out of peeling the spuds.
Yeah, that was we were the first arty platoon. We were called the transport section, and our job was to go ahead of the recruits. In this case, there was about 400 guys going to go to a place called Tihoi, which is on the western side of Magakino, and in those days it was just scrub and rubbish and rabbits and hares, and so anyhow, we were there, and the deal was we had to establish the cookhouse and had to do the latrines, which was a piece of scrim on sticks, and we had a plank with about 7 holes that we hand-sawed cut in it so the guys could squat and sit. So I said to the guys who were digging the trench, and it was in sand, I said, we'll dig outside the scrim, and I said, we'll get that flamethrower thing that we had in the truck, we'll sit that. So anyhow, little be known, the guys that sat in there, because they were trying to hide, they didn't want to listen to anything else, and they were all sitting in there with their backsides, and so I lit this flamethrower that tossed the flame about 20 feet through the trench, and it let out a howl, and all these guys sort of realised that they were on fire.
Yeah.
But, I think you had to have a sense of humour, and I think I shared that with the guys, and I suppose you could say when you're a young fella, you were paying a third of your wages in tax, and I said to the guys, we've just got to get some of that back. So anyhow, in that same week, we ended up being at Moose Lodge at Rotoiti. And on our way there, it quite a while when you got 17 or 18 GMCs, and on one of the GMCs we had 7 Indian motorbikes, and they were going to be whatever. So when we got halfway at Ruruwhakaitu, senior guys they were conscripted as who they were. They thought they were gun-ho guys. One was a school teacher, I don't know what the other fellow was, but they were lieutenants and all that, and I by this time was a corporal or a sergeant. So anyhow, they left us in the hay paddock with all these trucks and pitched the tents, and this is about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you can imagine a bunch of guys all fidgeting around us. I said, let's get these motorbikes off the truck and we'll have a motorbike rally, and we'll peg out the side up the hill and around there, which we did. And of course we're in a hay paddock with the grass about 2 feet high. And so, of course, we pegged it all out. And 1 or 2 of our guys were actually motorcycle clubs, and they knew a little bit about it. So, anyhow, we had a ball. We wrecked the 7 motorbikes. We chucked all of back in the back. And of course, our 2 NCOs or seniors didn't end up coming back until it was dark. And come the morning, of course, so I got all the guys up and we pitched our tent and we buggered off because we knew we were going. And our 2 guys were still shicker in the tent. So you can imagine the farmer in the morning looking at his hay paddock because we'd stuffed it.
That's awesome. The book's called Prime Mover, The Remarkable Life of Warwick Johnson. I've got Warwick Johnson here with me. We're having a wonderful chat and an interview. And we're going to move back into, after the army, house moving. And your dad sort of retired and you went into business on your own, and then blow me down, he come back and against as opposition.
Yeah, what happened there in 1952, I suppose I'd been working with him for 4 or 5 years, and it was all right. I never had an argument, but I could see that there was an opportunity. In Hamilton, there was 11 transit camps that the Americans had, and they were huts that were 28 feet by 10 feet. So in the old language, whatever, that's about 12 metres by 3 and a bit. And the idea was Dad had this trailer built specially to shift them. Too cumbersome, you couldn't get into the yard. And the opportunity for me, I spied a bus chassis sitting at the local Bedford people. It was an SB Bedford 1952 with just a set of chassis rails and an engine. So I took it to the local Pomeroys, the bodybuilders, and I said, build a cab on it. And they had struggled to find the doors, so I said, well, take them off those dairy company trucks that got parked up there. They wouldn't miss a couple. So we ended up with the doors. We were able to build the cab on this particular truck, and the truck was a fantastic success. For 20 years, we drove that truck. It was absolutely outstanding. And being a bus chassis, it was terribly strong with a good low chassis. So I painted the truck blue. Our trucks were green, so I painted it blue. When Dad and Mum found out what I'd done, there was a bit of hostility, and the accountant arrived one morning about 7 o'clock, and I said, what the hell are you lost? And he said, no, he said, we're going to have a meeting. And I said, well, I've got things to do. No. Unbeknown to me, they had arranged to set up a company, and that was 1952, and they gave me, out of 1,000 shares, that'd be £1,000, I got £200, so I was in the money. So I became a shareholder. So move on, and we go to 1957, 58. And by that time, we're doing those transit huts and all that. And through the ministry local, there was a guy called Ben Waters. Anyhow, he talked to Dad about shifting these buildings that were at Merrimurray. They had to go to Magakino. And Dad told him, he said, we're not interested in that. He walked out the yard and he got on his push bike to ride away. And I waylaid him and I said, what's this you're talking about, the buildings? And he said, well, your dad's not interested. I said, well, why don't you talk to me? I must have been about 20, 21, and I told Dad what I'd done. So anyhow, it was 123 mile, I reckon £1 a mile, I'd be in the money. I went to the ministry up in Day Street and I signed a piece of paper that said I'm involved, and Dad got the pricker and he said you can have the company, which I took the company on. And of course it was a 2-year event to shift these 200 houses to Magakino. So what happened, which was rather interesting, there was 200 of these so-called houses, and the idea was the ministry had set out a specification, and it didn't talk about tandem running, and I had that in my head that if I had the second truck, that my £1 a mile going to Magakino for 123 mile, coming back with the second truck. So every time my speedo on my truck was actually my bank balance. The long and the short of it was I took on the contract and successfully did the job. Being successful, the money came through the till, and my dad and my younger brother Graham, unbeknown to my mother, he got another truck and trailer designed and built by Tids and Hawkins. The long and the short of it was I had opposition. I had my father and my brother Graham running along as Bert Johnson and Son, and when they'd asked Dad where I was, he said to be at Magakino or Turangi somewhere, can I be of some help? So, of course, straight away the heckles on the back of my head, yeah, that was probably a bitter pill to swallow.
But you worked really hard until you were able to buy them out.
Oh, it was endless. And of course, I had a wonderful bunch. There were 3 other guys and myself, and by that time we were a real hardcore bunch of guys, and people would come onto the job and they'd say to you guys don't talk. And I said, well, we don't have to talk. We know each other. We know exactly what we're doing. That went on for some years, and in the end, I was so annoyed about my brother and what was happening, and and I suppose I was the fit rat in the family, and I took my brother on to task. I said, well, I'm going to buy you out whether you like it or not. So I had a 10-acre block with a house in Hamilton, so I said, you could have that. I'll have your gear, which I did.
Of course, the era was such a fantastic era. There were so many big projects. There were dams. There was the Cowrail. There was the dam.
Exactly.
Matahina.
Yeah.
It was
endless. Out of Mangakino, the MDF that built the Mary Power Station, they took on the paper mill at Caxton at Cowrail. Chief there came to me and he said, Warwick, he said, we've got all that row of houses there and the 400 huts. He said, all that's going to Cowrail. Have you got a price? You got something in your mind? I said, well, it's going to cost you $1 or $2. He said, don't worry about the money. He said, I'm telling you, I want you to do it. So anyhow, tandem again. These houses were Keith Hay built, pre-builts that were sitting on it. Anyhow, there was 20, maybe 25 of those, and complete with furniture and all. We would jack them up and we'd end up in Cowrail the next day, and the people who were, all their furniture was in it and everything. So
didn't you have to put them on the train?
Probably back in the early days, and the stupid railway had a thing to do with licensing, and you couldn't get a permit to shift over about 30 mile, but because we had a building on that was, say, 25, 30 foot wide, the railway couldn't handle that. So we really were fortunate. We got a licence for the whole of the North Island for relocating transportable buildings or building material, which was really a fantastic plus.
Yeah. So it was the smaller buildings that went on the rail.
Huts that
went on the rail.
And they, when I put the pressure on the railway, they could only supply 4 railway wagons. No, 7 UB wagons. So they took 4 huts to each wagon. And so we roped them on, and the deal was that they'd end up at Cowrail, but they couldn't go through the tunnel. They couldn't do a lot of things, so they ended up in Rotorua, and we had to go and pick them up from there. By that time, we had 2 truck and trailers in our Bedford. We could shift about 17 or 18 huts in one go, and we'd arrive at Cowrail, and then we'd spend back to the railway yard at Rotorua and shift those other ones. So by and large, that's what we did.
So with the Keith Hay homes from Mary that went to Cowrail, were you able to do that overnight?
Actually, in those days, it was daylight. And
right.
When I say, daylight, we'd leave Mary at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We tried to work at we had a problem to get through Hamilton, so we had to deviate round through Rototuna and get back to our yard at Tamaheri, which was perfect for the spot. So we'd refuel. Our trucks were petrol, and then we'd leave about 4 a.m. in the morning, and we weren't supposed to, but it was the imperative to get out on the road and get cracking, and we'd end up going through Rotorua, through the back of Rotorua, through the Rotomar Hills and all up round through there. And of course, they'd never had buildings go through there, so you could imagine me we invented a chainsaw about that time, and going through Hongi's Track and a few places like that, we were very good at giving them a haircut.
Right.
And,
so what were you pulling them with, truck-wise?
It was rather interesting because I'd proven with Ross Todd Motors, they had the franchise for the international trucks. And way back when I got the Mary contract, I went to Ross Todd and I said, I've got a piece of paper here that says I've got 200 houses. I said, I haven't got any money, but I said, I need a truck. So Norm Todd, he was one of the directors, and he laughed and he said, let's have a look at the paper. So within 7 days, they had a brand new international there for me. He said, Warwick, try this, away you go. So that was the beginning of a fantastic friendship with Norm Todd and Jim Ross, the pair of them. They're a bunch of hard cases. So the international, they were petrol, and they used petrol at about 2 gallons of petrol. So every truck we had to have 44-gallon drum of petrol as well. So they were petrol was about 1 or 6 a gallon. And
so you were at a pound a kilometre. You were in the money.
Yeah, well, never thought about it, but different people said I'd go broke. But the fact that we were tandem running. Now, what I must say with that government contract, what it said, the Ministry of Transport had to provide the pilot. So that was okay. So sure, prior to that, Dad would use the Model A with a dunny door with a go slow wide loading, a red flag, and then the Ministry of Transport said that they had to provide the pilot. So that was all right. So we arranged for every other day at Miri to have a Ministry of Transport pilot. It took 2 years, and we tandemed those houses out of Miri to Mangakino. We had the fantastic two-way radio supplied by Tate from Christchurch. It was the best thing that ever happened, because in those earlier days you had a two-way radio with crystals and the vibration on the truck. You could throw the two-way radio out the window. But the Tate one came up with a I describe it as like a lot of wires soldered onto a piece of cardboard, and bolted them in the truck, and they were absolutely fantastic. So then we had a pack set with a jumper leads we'd bolted onto the old Zephyr. We generally had worn out Zephyr cars as cop cars, and with the jumper leads we had a red light up on top of that sign that we screwed onto the top of the Zephyr. So here we go again. Here we are with a red light and the cop with our two-way radio, and he was our pilot. And all those 2 years, we never ever had an accident. Never ever. And the cop did it. Here's the other funny part. When we get to Mangakino, the cop was fairly well buggered, and, it was a slow journey in those days. So he'd don off his cop gear and he'd put his boots on, his old clothes, and he'd give us a hand for an hour or two. And, of course, there was always a few dollars passed, and it would be in pounds, shillings and pence. But the cops in those days were the same age as myself, and we were like a family.
Yep.
And they just loved it. They loved the fact that we shared the time.
Yeah, and you said in the book that the police in those days were terribly paid.
Yeah. Oh, incredible.
Between the Mary Cowrail and the Mary Mangakino for the dams, how many houses do you reckon? Houses and huts do you reckon you moved?
It went on like a snowball. It just got more and more, and the ministry kept throwing more jobs at me.
Yeah.
And of course, this is interesting to do with Turangi, and they came to me, and we'd already shifted the buildings that we took from Miri to Mangakino, those 200. We picked them up and took them to Titeko and Matahina to doing the earth dam at Matahina.
Yeah.
So when that was finished, we bought all those, and they all came back into other hydro projects. They said to me, Warwick, this is Peter Armstrong and Johnny Benyon, and they were the seniors. And I suppose you could say I knew these guys. They said, Warwick, we're looking at taking Mangakino to Turangi. We're going to set up a set up there for about a 15 or 20 years, and we want you to price the houses to go. In those days, the Western Access Road wasn't there. You can thank Hollyoak for that. He bought a farm around there, and he wanted a road to go around the western side of the lake, so it wasn't there in those days, so there was no way the houses out of Mangakino were going to go to Turangi. So I said that. I said, hey, why don't you let me talk about transportable houses? You could build a transportable house, and in a 10-year time, it would be doubled in value. And, of course, they threw the book at me and said, Warwick, you go away and sort it out, which I did. And I suppose you could say for the next 2 or 3 years, we spent carting houses to Turangi. So,
and where did they come from, Warwick?
Basically, Rotorua. There were four. There was Lockwoods and Hunts and Richard Frost and Beasley's, and then across, that was in Tauranga and Rotorua, and then there was a chap in Tamaranui, Braithwaite was his name, and I suppose we rattled amongst those guys and said, well, this is what we need. And what I didn't realise that their prices were handed to the ministry, whatever they got for that, but I had the job to shift the houses. So in that period of time, I suppose you could say, I often think how many loads I would have done, but in hindsight, I would have probably taken 2,000 buildings and bits and pieces, because Mangakino was shelling out, and it wasn't the houses I shifted, it was all the work sheds and different blocks of buildings and other infantry, machinery and all sorts of stuff. So you can imagine how my marriage suffered about all that, because I was never home. And the simple thing was that we just had scheduled rates, and we didn't need any paperwork, and the money always came into my bank account every Monday and whatever.
Turangi was actually a town that was delivered. It wasn't actually built.
Yeah, Turangi. When I went to in all those hydro sites, there were always lupins and bull and rushes and rubbish. And when we got there, of course, the motor scrapers were ripping around, and you got 4 seasons in one day. And it was either raining or dust, or and here we were trying to work, and all we had was a peg in the ground with a number on it, and that's where that house went.
Yeah.
So we had a team of 2 groups of guys at Turangi that bunked in there, and by then the cookhouse was there, and I suppose you could say with 2 or 3 years, maybe more. Overall, the hydro years was about 12 years of hydro work. That was, and here was the ministry trying to put the screws on us about our road transport. And of course, I would hammer them on. I'd say, well, 80-90% of our work is for the bloody government. Can't you get real? Let's sort it out. So, in a way, it was beneficial. We actually used that as a lever in towards road transport.
Yep, interesting. And an interesting part, just in the early years before I move on, was how your mother you had other ideas like aviation or working for Caesar Roos, going to Hawaii, and she kept nipping it in the bud and stopping you doing, didn't you?
I had a fantastic mother. She was like, I suppose you could say, mother superior. But anyhow, it must have been about the time I bought the Bedford truck. I biked out to James Aviation at Rookahare. We were in Hamilton East. So anyhow, I met Ozzy. Ozzy James was there. And anyhow, I said, I want a job as a loader driver. And I gave him the phone number and all that. And anyhow, the next day at home, the phone rang and Mum answered the phone. And the fellow said, oh, it's Mr. James here. I want to talk to Warwick. And Mum said, well, what's that about? And she said, well, I've got a job for him as a loader driver. And Mum says, Mr. James, I think you've got the wrong number. She hung up.
And of course, Caesar Roos wanted to take you to Hawaii.
Yeah. There was another one about the same time. What happened, that Caesar bought one of these LTS, like a tank landing craft that had a very shallow draft, and he'd bought this thing on tender in Honolulu, and he had to have non-union guys to handle the boat. So, of course, old Jack Watts, the manager at the yard in Hamilton, he said, boy, got a job for you. The chief wants you to go to whatever, Honolulu, and help him bring this boat back. So I went all jubilant. I went home and told Mum, I'm going to Honolulu. And Mum said, no, you're not. You get malaria and all other sort of things. And of course, today's day, I'd tell Mum where to go and I'd be gone anyhow.
Yeah.
But in those days, your mother was boss.
Talk to me for a moment about the advancements in jacking houses, the arrival of the Trowella jack.
That's a history thing in its own, and most of the removal guys don't really realise the impact that we had. John Chambers in Hamilton was an engineering importing company, and during the war years they had a big plate glass window with all this tools and mechanism in the window with all discounted price, and because there was no imports, sitting in there was these 2 Trowella jacks that were only about a metre high, about 4 foot high, and Dad and I were there looking at this. In fact, while we were there, we were looking at a building right alongside to reblock it. And of course, here we are caulking it there. And I said to Jack, we could alter those to cut that off and do that. So anyhow, he bought those 2 jacks and took them home. They were what they call stumping devils. And it had a funny, like a claw jaw on it. So cut that off and put a plate on it. And of course, the first thing that was wrong was that we needed another half a dozen or more. Two wasn't going to do anything. Prior to that, if you lifted a building, you used a bottle jack, which was a screw jack, and of course you had wheelbarrow loads of packing, and of course it would take a week to lift a building. But we could see the vision. So this Ben Waters, again, from the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Works it was, went to him and we said to him, Ben, we need to get an import licence from these jacks that are in Trentham, Australia. The wheels set in motion, and half a dozen jacks turned up, and of course they were like gold. And straight away we were loading these transit huts we talk about, and of course 4 of those jacks, you'd lift the transit hut up within an hour, you'd load it, and they were absolutely outstanding. From there, of course, the restrictions and import licences were negative. You just couldn't get anywhere with the government, but fortunately the ministry realised that the importance of the building removal industry was more or less getting into a better gear. What happened, I went across to Australia, to Trentham, Victoria. It's in Melbourne, Victoria, and I met these 2 American guys that were making these these Truella jacks, and I said, hey, you guys, this is what we need. We need to do this, and they got to be 5 or 6 foot tall, not this. Anyhow, straight away, they took on the task. The first 16 or 20 came by licence, and that took a while. And eventually we got an import licence for these Truella jacks that we used to bring them in 50 at a time, and we'd pass them on to all the different house removal guys in New Zealand. I don't think they realised the fact that what we'd done, but we'd what you call stirred the tripe, and these jacks were, for 30 years we used those jacks. They were absolutely outstanding. In fact, to give you an example, Hawkins at Kinleith, they were building the paper mill machines, and this particular building needed to be lifted up about 4 or 5 feet, and it was for storing the paper. So they had 50 of these columns, and the idea was to jack the roof up another 4 feet, and the Hawkins guy said, was it opportune? So I said, yeah, we could do that. So we assembled the 50 jacks, a jack at each of those columns with a vertical, working at ground level, and the roof was already 10 metres high or 30 feet or more. So, of course, it needed 50 guys, so we organised all that through the riggers and the fitters and our gangs. And in a total day, those Truella jacks, we lifted the total roof up 4 feet, and they swung the pieces of steel in that were hanging by a chain, and it only took a day. It's all done.
All done.
So the jacking system, you can imagine us with those jacks for 30 years, and by that time they gravitated all through. Every house removal guy in New Zealand had them. And I'll give you an instance that a friend of mine in Invercargill became a friend. That was Fred Willison, working for King Removal, building removals. Anyhow, for some reason, we talked about what we had with the Truellas, and Fred said, is there any chance of getting some of those jacks? And I said, yeah. I said, as a matter of fact, we've got a surplus lot here. If you like, I'll put 20 odd on a little truck that I've got, and I'll bring a set down. Will you do that? He said, I'll pay for them. The little international truck, I loaded the jacks on, and with the braces and the handle and the pegs. And I said to Fred, you line up 5 houses for the week that I'm there, and we'll shift the 5, one a day. Would you do that? They were doing one a week by using bottle jacks and trying to lift these damn silly houses. And of interest, it was for Richardson that's got the Hall of Fame down there. Anyhow, he was building pre-builts, and here I turned up with his little international with these Truella jacks on, and of course, Fred had a pug-nosed Nissan with a high-deck trailer, and we jacked the first one up, and we did the 5 houses in a week. And the Richardson guy came to me and he said, any chance of getting some of those jacks? He said, they're obviously good. I said, we'll actually run out of credit. We've got no more licence, because I was trying to protect Fred. So that really put Fred on his feet.
And then, of course, Arthur Wilcox with the hydraulic.
Yeah. Well, Arthur's dad his father was Frank, and he was a hard case guy. He shouldn't have been a house mover. He was a clever bugger, and he was building those big log grapples that could unload 30 tonne off a logging truck, and he would make them out of whatever he could find. That was Arthur's dad, and that was Frank. But anyhow, he loved shifting houses because there was a joke. With every house he shifted, there was a joke. And Arthur, of course, must have inherited some of Frank's skills, because Arthur inadvertently decided to build a hydraulic jack, and what he found was 2 pieces of steel, the Japanese RHS in 4 inches and the American RHS 4 inches, one fitted over the top of the other. So all he had to do was to put a hydraulic ram inside all that, and a tap at the bottom, and bingo, he had a jack. And Arthur, as clever as he was, he made these jacks, and of course I found out what he was doing, and I said, how about bringing a set down to the yard? And which he did. So the jacks didn't leave the yard. I paid for them, and that was really the start of Arthur. Brilliantly, he made these. They were heavy and strong, and but that was the revolution. That was the finish of the 30 years of the Truella jacks.
Yep.
It was something that we always talked about, but Arthur, with the brains that he had,
yep,
and of course you always had a spare time shifting a building. You might have had a day where there was no permits or you didn't have a job. So Arthur would turn his engineering ability and he made these checks. So he deserved the full credit.
For us, the name Warwick Johnson is inextricably linked to the Tamaheri yard.
Yeah.
And when you used to go past there, you'd look out, see if there was a truck in there or
That's
something
right.
you'd see. But the whole Tamaheri yard, all the way through, you encompass this sense of fun and adventure
That's right.
and inclusion,
That's right.
including people. Like you in the book, you say Tamaheri House and Yard, a 10-acre playground of houses, trucks, cars, tractors, horses, goats and sheep, and the ginkgo biloba tree, of course. But there's that, you try and make what is a really hard job a fun adventure for everyone involved, including the kids.
I was up against the fact that my wife wasn't prepared to help me. She said to me, "You got yourself into it, you get yourself out of it." So that was it. But you could imagine the phone that would continually ring. You became synonymous. It was a bit like Weet-Bix or Sanitarium Health Food, or the name Johnson became synonymous with shifting a building. And even today, people realise that, yep, that was it. So that was a generation of time.
But you were also a troubleshooter for buildings in trouble. Like people used to get you if there was a building on a lean or tipped up or collapsed foundations it wasn't necessarily moving it. Sometimes it was saving it.
Yeah, I had a phone call from the police in Napier one time. They rang up and they said, "What was I doing?" I said, "I'm standing here talking to you." He said, "But let's get serious." He said, "We've got an operator here with a house out on the road and the thing's starting to open up. It had been shifted before, but it hadn't been put together properly and it was all splitting and it was out on the road." And they said, "Could I possibly bring 2 truck and trailers?" So the next day we were in Napier with our 2 truck and trailers and we collapsed and undid the house. And
yeah.
So there were things like that.
The Hauraki Plains house on the peak that had broken or collapsed floor and you had to repile it down.
Yeah, well, every house has its own story. So the different jobs that you got involved with. I had a phone call one night, 10 o'clock at night, and this fellow rang me. He identified it was me, and I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I want to shift my house." He said, "It's falling into the sea." I said, "Well, when you're sober in the morning at 6 o'clock, you ring me." And I made out, I thought he was drunk, you see. So 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings, and he said, "I'm bloody serious." He said, "The porch has gone overnight," and he said, "The house is going to go." He said, "Would you come?" So this was down at Mopew, down the coast towards New Plymouth. So we bundled everything in, and by about midday that day, we rescued the house off the cliff. It was about 100 feet straight down to the sea.
And then there was the Harsent house at Hahe, where the foundations in the sand.
Oh yeah, that was another one. That was a fellow there, Fred Harsent. And he was a very clever guy making saddles for the American. He made a saddle for horses. But anyhow, he probably had plenty of money at the Hot Water Beach. And they built this flash house up on the top of the sand. And the whole house had about a 12-inch lean. The whole thing was leaning. And, of course, the sand was getting blown away with the wind. So anyhow, it had a concrete floor. So anyhow, the back end was all right. So we put our jacks, our bottle jacks. We had 20-ton jacks, and we put them in and lifted the building up. And, of course, the next thing was to cut holes inside the house with the floor and shovel the sand in with the water. And, of course, we just kept wheeling the sand in until it was all chocker. And we lifted the house above the datum so that it would settle down a bit, which it did. Yeah, that was just another one. So, it goes on.
The move that put you on in the television in the living rooms of everyone in the country is
we call it St Mary's.
The St Mary's Cathedral move.
Prior to that, I suppose you could say I had a history of shifting churches. I used to shift an average of about seven churches a year throughout the North Island. I've become known as a church guy. So the phone rang this day, and it was the guy, Dean Reimer. He was the so-called parson or minister of the Anglican Church at Parnell. I get up there and I open the trap door, and it's something that happens when the experience you have. In this case, I opened the trap door and all the cobwebs and everything came out with the doors. I pulled the door open. You know what that told me? I was the only guy that opened that trap door, so I knew that I had the key in my pocket. So I said to Dean Reimer, I said, "We better have a cup of tea and talk about this." So went over to his parsonage, sat there. He was an Aussie. He's the minister of Anglican or whatever. he was telling me how they're going to dismantle the church, and was I interested in, you're going to set up a tower crane in the middle of Parnell Road, and they'd flick it all over and rebuild it. And I said, well, why don't you shift it in one piece? And he said, he was sort of gobsmacked a bit. He said, really? You could do that? And I said, yeah. I said, yeah, I reckon I could shift it. So anyhow, that's with Becker Carter. They had to have an engineer because I wasn't qualified as an engineer. They didn't know who the hell I was. So anyhow, I submitted a price. I think it was about £173,000, and that was back in 1980. I'm losing track of it. 1981, because 1982 was the day we shifted it. But in 1981, at the tail end of that year, it was a case of starting to look the possibility of assembling the gear, and of course that just didn't happen straight away. And I went to the Huntley power site, and I got some massive big steel beams, and I had all them to weld up. So 4 of those made a beam that was 65 feet long. I did several of those. And I learned how to weld, did all that. So so we jacked the building up, jacked it up in the air, and set to move it across the road. And,
How heavy was it? What?
Well, what happened, Becker Carter, and you relied on, here we go, professional guys, and they slipped up there. What they didn't realise that the studs of the building were 8 by 6, and that's 8 inches by 6 inches, and they were 26 feet long, and about every 2 to 3 feet there's what you call a stud. Anyhow, of course there was that, and then the weatherboards on the outside were pit sawn because the building was 96 or 98 years old, and the weatherboards were all pit sawn. So, and then of course it come to the stage of saying, well, what about the match lining? So the match lining inside was exactly the same. So here were the walls about 16 or 18 inches thick, and the window sills, I should have realised that the sill board, it was big enough for you to sit on. It was about 14 or 15 inches, and of course that was the width of the frame. So it added another 96 tonne to the weight of the building. So the building, they estimated it around about 230 odd tonne or something like that. It ended up at about 378 tonne. And of course the jacking system, unbeknown to me, we were at maximum, and was quite serious. In fact, I can say I cringe to do today for the risk that we took. The jacks, I had 10 of those American Unified jacks that were perfect for the job, but I needed another set of 10, which I organised through a phone call through Robin Renshaw of Chicago. So anyhow, the jacking system arrived, and we jacked the building up. And when we put the pressure on, of course the building was that heavy, the valves on the jacking systems, they just squealed, they just whistled. So I rang Renshaw in America, and I said, Robin, your jacking system is not working, we can't lift the building. And he said, I shouldn't tell you, but he said, there's a little valve underneath such and such. If you were to twist that around a bit, he said, you'll increase the pressure. So of course we increased the thing, and of course the whistling stopped and the thing went up. And so here we were sitting up in the air, 22 inches up in the air on 20 jacks, weighing 370 odd tonne, thank you very much. And of course we had to put the plates and the rollers in to start the roller. So there we were, yeah. Massive.
And and you say the pine rollers compared to the Remu rollers.
Yeah, well, going back into yesteryear, the veneer cores that we used to get were Remu, and of course they were as hard. They were the centre core of a tree. When I tried to get Remu centre core rollers, which were 9 inches in diameter, I couldn't get them. I ended up with pine, and the pine was soft. Okay, so the idea was put more in, but as the rollers were coming out the back, they were squashed. They were probably dented by about 1.5 inches. They were virtually the back end. The back wall of the building weighed nearly 90 tonne, and of course the steel was bending down, or it wasn't bending, but the weight was intense. And what was happening with the excavators digging out underneath, we'd stirred up the ground, made it like porridge, and of course the tail of the building was sinking back down, and I knew, I wasn't telling anybody else, but I said, well, let's get this damn thing going, because the more the ground underneath was turning to porridge, and of course the rollers were there, they were getting decimated. We were in trouble. We had the trucks and the winching power, and we winched the thing across the road.
And then you
took 6 hours.
swung it around into position.
Yeah, they said it was impossible. What the hell do you think you're doing? And there were different people in the group of about 5,000 or 6,000 people that were all walking around thinking health and safety today. No question of that.
Yeah,
there were wire ropes and excavators and cranes and all that, and of course the photos don't do justice to the number of people, but there were thousands of people. There would be guys that were professional and one or two house movers, and they said, Warwick, it's impossible. How the hell are you going to turn it? And they said, you'll never do it. And I said, well, I'm going to have to do it, because in the early days, if they were Rimu rollers, you could cut the rollers and you could walk the building around, which is what I intended to do. But of course, the pine rollers, you hit them with it, they just weren't going nowhere. So here I was, cleft stack, with a thing straight across the road with no knowledge of how I was going to turn it. So
and so you used hydraulic dollies to do that?
Yeah, so what happened from then, Trevor Jones from the story thickens. Dale Heavy Haulage, Dale's, the fella carpenter was at the stage of selling up Dale's, and there was a yard full of stuff. The committee trailers were there, and there was a massive big turntable that was as big as the sitting room, and it was the keystone for twisting the building. So when you put two pieces of paper, one on top of the other, you'd naturally put that in the centre, and you think, well, that's where you'd turn it. It so happened, the two pieces of paper, the turntable, was way down the back end of the church, and that's where the pivot had to be when you twist two pieces of paper around. So I did that. And then the deal came with carpenter for the two trailers. So the freightways, they puffed themselves up and put their banners on and made out that they were shifting the building. And they said, Warwick, as long as we can fly the flag, we don't want you can have the trailer. So, a bit more graft. So there's a bit of sort of petty cash went underneath the whatever.
Yeah.
And the freightway Dale's guys, they were neat guys. There's photos of some of them there.
Yeah.
They gave us a hand for a few days while we twisted it around, and we put every wheel at the centre to that turntable was all at 90 degrees of that. Now, here's an interesting thing. The whiskers that we made at the yard were longer than the width of the building, so they stuck out either side, and there was a row of about 7 or 8 sticking out, and of course we had guys with a laser level and the engineers telling us that we were going to buckle their building and all that, so that here were these steel beams. So what happened?
So the whiskers are the steel beams, the runners under the building?
Yeah, they were massive. They were 12 inches square. They were massive, and they would come from the Huntley power side, and I put 4 of those welded together, and of course the welder guy that showed me how to do it, he said the welding will be stronger than the steel.
Yeah.
So I felt happy about that. So then to keep the building in line, what I did, the beam at, we'll say that end and the beam at the other end, I put a string line and built a packing and put a string line over that. And then when you go to the beach and you make a sandcastle, so I made a sandcastle on each of those beams, and I stuck a little pin in it, that string line was there. So the string line was over the top of that pin, and as we were winching, you could keep that, we had about 7 winches twisting it around, but the simplicity of it and how clever I was, I kept the building with the string line with that pin there. You could say that was it.
That was it.
And the guys walking around, these engineers and Becker Carter and all the clever buggers, and here I was, and that was my magic, being able to keep the building in a straight line.
Yeah.
So,
but
you can probably say that experience is a great teacher, and there's no shortage of that in our type of industry, and most house removal guys are very clever, and don't underestimate them.
well, look at lowering big tanks using blocks of ice.
Lowering
big tanks using blocks of ice.
Yeah, that was the oil tanks. That was the Shell oil in Mount Maunganui, and for some reason I got a call to would I possibly lift the tank, and of course I'd never done one, but I got them to brace the inside and whatever. So we put our 60-odd jacks right round with a unified jack, and we lifted it up 4 feet, put it on pigsty so they could build a new base, whatever they did, and they tar sealed it all. And of course the day come to let it down, and the superintendent said, Warwick, you just not going to dig my bloody tar seal up? And I said, no, it's all right. I got it sorted out. And I knew that the second tank, they were mumbling about that, and I said, well, how about we do a deal with the 2 tanks together, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. So, yeah, okay, righto. So anyhow, I said, I'm going to use blocks of ice. And I had a cool store guy down the road with 60 apple boxes with plastic bags, and he'd made a half-ton truckload of ice blocks. So later in the day, the little truck turned up with all these ice blocks about the size of an apple box. We put all them around the tank, took our jacks away because lowered it down, and these ice blocks were about, in the old language, 14 inches high, maybe like that, a bit higher. Anyhow, took our jacks away, and of course you'd say, well, the whole thing's going to crunch and crap to the ground. Well, it didn't go like that. So here we were sitting wondering what was going to happen. So I said to one of my guys, you go around that way and I'll go this way. So you just tapped it with a sledgehammer and it would shatter like crystal. So it took about 4 hours for the ice to melt. So here he is on the phone to England, to Shell Oil, and he said, believe it or not, these bloody stupid Kiwi guys, he said, they've let my tank down on blocks of ice.
And how heavy was the tank?
Yeah. It would be over 120 tonne, maybe more. No, we didn't know, didn't monitor the weight. But anyhow, we did the second tank the same, and then from then I did another 6 or 7 in Napier or down at Nelson with my son Grant. He went down there and did those with the dollies that Peterkin did.
Yeah, cool.
Interesting.
So the book's called Prime Mover, The Remarkable Life of Warwick Johnson. We've barely touched on the stories that are in it, and we're not going to tell you them all because you're going to have to go on to newzealandtrucking.co.nz, the shop, and buy yourself your own copy. It is a remarkable piece of New Zealand transport history written by a remarkable man. And how old are you today, Warwick?
I'm 88. In fact, I keep adding that up, but I reckon I'm 88, so I'm ticking on.
Yep, and it's sharp as a tack.
Well, I'm all right. My head's all right. That's on my shoulders, but from the shoulders down, I'm what you call bugging. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I never thought that would happen. Dad used to say, you wait until you get to my age, boy.
Okay, the book is called Prime Mover, The Remarkable Life of Warwick Johnson. And look, to be fair, we've barely touched on the stories that are in the book. There's a fantastic story about Warwick's encounter with a real-life gangster and how he got the better of him. And Warwick himself, sitting here, says the book itself is probably 10% of his life stories that he could have put in. It could have been the size of a phone book. A remarkable snapshot of an amazing man's career in the building removal game, and he's right here with me now. And Warwick, I want to move now on to, we're a trucking magazine, first and foremost, and I want to move on to trucks and trailers. And in the book you actually say that your love of trailer design and building was so great that you almost ditch house moving for trailer design.
Yeah, I take you back in my life. The war years had just concluded, and impact was to have a trailer for shifting these transit camps. And Dad was talking to an engineer that would build the chassis, and the trailer had to be designed. It was over length, and it wasn't allowed to have a deck on it because we weren't allowed to carry cement or timber, so it was just an open frame. The front axle was out of a Morris commercial bus from the Huntley, and the back end was an axle that Jack Tidd found with some 6-stud Ford hubs, and the brakes were only 2 inches, and was all hydraulic. The only time the brakes worked was the day of the vehicle inspector, when he turned up, so we'd screw the valves up with a screwdriver, and of course it skid the wheels, no trouble. So that was that. The day he did the warrant, he sat on the back with a gallon tin of yellow paint, and I said, what's that for? And he said, I'm going to tip it on the tyre when you go up round the corner up there. And I said to Dad, make sure you go on the other side of the road when you go round the corner, because the trailer's going to cut across the grass. So when he got round the corner, the fella's hanging onto the trailer for grim death because Dad thought he had a horse and cart. So anyhow, the yellow paint was on the road. He said to Dad, it actually tracks brilliant. But he didn't know that the front part of the truck was on the other side of the road. So that was that. That was the start of it. And, of course, I was only about 16 or 17, and I think that at a younger age I was sharper. My dad was more interested in the horse and cart and a sledge or a konaki, and we go back beyond that to Pop. That was Dad's father-in-law or Mum's father, George Jack, and he made his wheels. He made them out of wood, and they were steel rim with wood put in the middle. Then he'd drill a hole in the middle and set fire to the centre to get it honed out to about a 5-inch cone, so a stub axle would fit on it. and the only lubrication they had was a 4-gallon tin of water that you had to walk alongside to tip it on the hub so it didn't catch on fire. The trailer that Dad built was done out of mostly second-hand stuff. The Chev truck, of course, was only a 4-6 ton Chev, so it was blessed with the job of handling the trailer, which it did. I suppose you could say we put up with that. I did, from my point of view. That was 1948, and during the 50s, the pressure where we needed a bigger platform trailer, we were always having to shift buildings with say 4 trucks, 2 going forward and 2 going back. So a 40-foot chassis was what we needed, which we got permission to build. And actually Hawkins built the steel frame and was 9'6" by 40 feet, and Tids did the wheel assembly. So that was the start of it. Prior to that, we used the dollies that Tid had, and we put them alongside that trailer, and we took 20 houses up to Kopuka, to the coal mine. That was when they were building the Mirimiri power station. And these wobbly wheel dollies would sit alongside the trailer, and I had the Bedford, SP Bedford bus chassis with a 2-speed diff, and the truck was 300 cubic inch, about 120 horsepower. Of course, that was the tractor. The dollies were there, we bolt them alongside, but there was no brakes and no air, no nothing. The vacuum 2-inch thing to the trailer was insignificant. So eventually the day came when we used those dollies in a steel frame, made a trailer. So when I took over in 1957, 58, of course that trailer was the keystone to what we were doing. Take you further along the trail, the Transport in General, that was Ian Stevenson and Bill Bock. They were just 2 young fellas that started a workshop in Kent Street in Frankton. And I said to them, I said, Ian, I want to build a couple of trailers. And I said, the loads we seem to do are about 36, 38, 40 feet. So to keep within the law, we built a trailer. We actually built 2 trailers that were 34 feet long, only by 8 foot wide. So I'm talking an imperial measurement. And of course they were 825 20 tyres, second hand. Of interest, they were Bedford hubs. You couldn't buy probably certified axles. The front axles, normally you'd target a 15-inch axle by buying an American low-loader trailer. You tip it upside down and you'd get the 15-inch wheels and hubs out of it. So Transport in General, they said to me, well, hey Warwick, we can't get those. So what we did, we got some 3-ton Bedford hubs that were only 16-inch. So we had 825 16-inch hubs, and it was totally unethical to use them, but that was really the best we could. So they had no brakes, and the ministry never picked up on the fact that they were only a certain tear, and they really weren't strong enough, but they did the job. And what Ian and Bill did there was fantastic. And they were vacuum, so that was okay. So the 40-footer was vacuum. Of course, those hydro houses out of Mirimiri were all done on those sort of trailers, and we progressed through that into the generation of change. And in that time, my dad actually copied the 40-foot trailer, and he had a similar one built, and with a Tid walking back end, and had a J6 Bedford that he used to do it, and he endeavoured to try and shift the house from Hamilton to Turangi, and it took him 17 hours, so that was the end of that. He only did one, that was the end of it. The advent of trailers, you're probably conscious of what's the change. By chance one day, this Chatham Island guy, old Manu Tuanui was his background, he came into my yard at Tamahiri. He said, I believe that you could be interested in a trailer. I knew of him as he had New Zealand arc welders in Rotorua, and his main job was building logging trailers with arc welding out on the sand, and massive big beams, and he did a trailer for our local opposition, Dick Devandia. And I said, well, similar to that, but... So anyhow, I drew on the sand with a stick what I said to Manu, and so I disappeared to his yard, and he was peticking in a caravan. He obviously hadn't been there long, and Manu said, there's a young fella over there in the caravan, you go and talk to him. So I did. You might say that Neil and I became very close friends straight away, and you could probably say for me I knew what I wanted, so with a stick in the sand, you draw in the sand what you wanted. And Neil, being an engineer, he could pick up on the thoughts, and that's really how it all started. It had to be, I said to Neil, it wants to be hydraulic, and the ministry wouldn't listen. And they said it had to have springs. And the history of springs, it's suicide, because the springs would collapse on one side and expand on the other. So if you wanted to tip a house off, have a chassis with springs. In the early days, we used to wire the chassis down with a number 8 wire and a block of wood, and we'd screw the chassis down to the axle. And that's how we got away with it. We could hold the balance by being rigid. So anyhow, Peterkin got to work and he built the trailer. All done without a permit, without any authority. The ministry weren't involved. It became a trombone. And, of course, it was 825 tyres with the 3 axles all joined together at the back with a floating bogie. The time came some months later, I was at the testing station at Rotorua, and the vehicle inspector said, your idea of the hydraulic trailer, what do you think about it? And I said, well, we've actually built one. It goes good. It goes to Turangi every night. It's got a house on it. Want to come around and have a look? So I chucked him in the car, and away we get. And he gets there, and of course here it is sitting in the yard with a house on it. So he didn't say too much. He walked all around it, and it had a Wankel motor up on the front on the gooseneck, and self-controlled. So I started it up, and I lifted it up and did all this and did all that. And he said, well, how come, he said, you're not an engineer. I said, it didn't have to be. I said, I had a fellow, Peterkin. I said, he's done the structural work. He said, well, how did you certify it? I said, well, all I did, I took the number plate off that trailer and put it on there. And I said, we've been going to Turangi for 6 months. And I said, you fellas weren't interested. So I said, we've proven a point. And I said, the hydraulic, you can throw the springs out the window. I said, your future trailers should be hydraulic, okay? So you could say that was the change in generation of, we'll call it trailer design. And Neil, I give him full credit for what he's done. And we did several trailers. And I've sat with him many a time at night time with a drawing board, and we'd spend all night until 7 a.m. in the morning, and the drawings would be really complete. And the fellas would turn up, and he'd be saying, well, we've got a job. And I'd say to Neil, you've got more than the job. I said, what you've just drawn is perfect. I said, what we'll do, I said, we'll build 2, not 1, we'll build 2. So believe it or not, we'd build 2, and the second trailer we'd bundle it on a ship and send it to Australia, because he had a guide in Surfers Paradise that was ex-Rotorua, and he was a friend of Neil's, so he was able to send the trailer to him, and he had it in his yard. And of course, the minute the Aussies saw a hydraulic chassis, of course, they panicked that we were going to go there and start up an opposition, so there was skin and hair flying there for a little while. So really, that's really what happened. And of course, trial and error. Rather than have money in the bank, you were better to build another trailer and improve on what you've already done. And the interesting story came as progress. We went from vacuum to air. So when a trailer was designed and built with full air, the trucks we had were still on vacuum. So the history unfolds. When we loaded the building with a truck was a full air trailer, and of course my truck was vacuum. So unbeknown to the ministry or other people that were involved, we used to have a piece of malthoid and we'd put it in the Namco fitting. So I'd drive the load with no brakes, and I'd have brakes on the truck, but the trailer was floating. So I'd go from wherever to Turangi with a 30-odd ton house on with no brakes. So I was able to do that.
Never had an issue?
Never, not an issue, no. Especially going downhill, that was exciting. So the evolution, the change, and of course it snowballed from there. And of course opposition people could see what we'd done, and they tried to copy. One or two, there was a chappie in Levin, made a trailer, an engineering fellow, and he made a very, very good job, very clever. The trombone trailer, he made it so good that when we had it after a week or two on the ground, on the road with the grit and the sand, you couldn't open the trombone because the grit had got between the two pieces of steel and it wouldn't open out. So there's another learning point, that to make a trombone you had to have a bit of a cavity there so that all your grit that you inhibited, I don't know where it ended up, but we didn't own it for very much longer.
And of course Neil went on to do wonderful things in his career.
Oh, Neil was a fantastic guy.
Just one of the icons of the industry, really.
He's got a brain on him I can't answer the fact that he's so clever, but I think it's going back again to his younger years when he apparently grew up as an apprenticeship on a ship, and then he got a job with the Mets, and whether it was down at Levin or down that way somewhere, I don't know. But when he came to Manu in Rotorua, of course Manu had him in a trailer caravan with a drawing board. That was all there was to it. But poor old Manu, he was an incredible guy and he was in terrible debt. And he actually said to me, he said, Warwick, he said, you can have this business, I don't want it.
And over the years, in the succeeding years, Warwick Johnson House Removals, you had both MTE and TRT gear?
Yes, I had a lot to do with TRT. I suppose it goes back to my dad, and Dad and Jack Tidd were good friends, and of course Tidd always did a wonderful job. There were opportunities that he did over the years for us, and naturally I went to him, and then there was another young fellow that broke away from Transport in General, Robin Radcliffe, and I gave Robin the chance to build a trailer, because by that time Neil had sold the Mets had taken over Neil in Rotorua and paid Neil $1 or $2, and regretfully Neil moved away from the trailer creation. That was a milestone that shouldn't have happened. But so Radcliffe got involved, and the experiences you have are such that certain things that are good and some things that are bad, and the gooseneck creation was, to me, important, and rather than just weld 2 bits of steel, you had to have a profile cut, and the profile was such that it was immensely strong. Swaps had a trailer some years before that, and the whole thing collapsed with the bulldozer on it, and the front part of the trailer dug into the ground and the bulldozer dislodged. So history repeats itself. So Robin he built what I call Mark 1 and Mark 2, and of course I wasn't interested until it got to the stage we had Mark 3, and by that time things were getting better, and he built the first trailer for me that was good, and it was a 3-axle, close axle, articulated, around about a 40-foot deck, perhaps a bit longer, tromboned out quite a bit. There were things that happened in that, of course, being air brakes and all that sort of thing. Then we got to the hydraulics dissolved and came to the discs. Instead of the hydraulic brakes, it became discs. So once we had everybody said that wouldn't work, it would get all the grip, but the discs, matter of fact, they're what every truck's got them today. An interesting thing that happened, and this is another thing that changes your life. To get an over-dimensional permit, in those days we had the fax machine, and the early days of the Ministry of Transport, to get a permit was just horrendous. You had to go there with a cap in hand and wait for the guy to sign the permit, and it created a problem to get a permit. And of course, as progress went on, they set up a central thing in Palmerston North for doing our permits, and I used to draw a drawing showing the illustration of the load and the weight and how the axle weights would be on the axle. And this particular day, I said to the girl down there, I said that I need an overweight on that particular drawing that I've sent you. And she said, Mr. Johnston, she said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But she said, if you had that axle out at 2.4, she said, I would give you the extra ton. I said, well, that's not going to happen overnight. I said, honey, give us the overweight for this one. And I said, I promise you here and now, we'll design a trailer with a 2.4 spacing. You could probably say that's how it all started. Little did that lady know how she changed the input on the hydraulic house trailer.
Right. Interesting, eh?
Yeah, just like that.
Just like that, yeah.
And, because then I was able to draw to scale the trailer with a 2.4.
You knew what you had to build to get your permit.
In that case, I said to Robin, there's a way to do that, because in the early days, to get it onto soft sand and in the mud, we'd use corrugated iron, and it would fold up and curl up around all your brake fittings and light fittings, and it was just an absolute disaster. So in the designing of the trailer and getting out to 2.4, we were able to put what we call a skid pan underneath the trailer.
Yes.
So the skid pan, if you were successful, you left the trailer down low, but the skid pan would slide you through the mud.
Yeah.
So that that became a fact.
Let's head to the front of the trailer. What's hooked to the front of it?
When Peterkin built the Tui trailer, of course, the turntable that we had on the truck, and this is interesting actually, I bought a 4x2 Mercedes truck and we were going to use it on that trailer, and the first day I put it under there it was absolutely hopeless, so I gave that truck away to Taylor and Cully, and they gave me an International, an R190, was an R200 with an 8V53 Detroit, and of course the gooseneck was only made long enough to take for a short 4x2. So straight away we had to shift the turntable, and we put the turntable some 8 or 9 inches back behind the centre line. If you're a truckie and reading the instructions of how your turntable was, it had to be so many whatever, and as a forward length. And here we were with the turntable about 8 inches behind the centre line. And the ministry never ever picked that up. But it was brilliant because it took the front axle off the ground, and we're in soft ground with a bit of power. All the weight was on the back end, so we had ultimate traction. So,
and was that a good machine, that truck?
Yeah, the truck was a fantastic truck.
So what sort of gearbox in that truck?
It had a 5-speed with a 4-speed. And, of course, you could probably say I was a professional driver. I could drive it without using the clutch. I could do all sorts of things. So for 3 years, from 1971 through that time, I drove that truck, and we had a yard in Rotorua, Hamilton and Auckland, and I'd line up Rotorua with 5 houses in that week, and 5 in Hamilton, 5 in Auckland, back to Hamilton for 5. So I did that for 3 years, and that trailer became a legend on the highway because it was hydraulic. And there's a bit of a hard case story attached to that. I was coming out of Auckland one night, and I don't know how I came by. I had a whole heap of steel, angle-iron steel, that was about 40 feet long, and I think it was quite heavy. And the cop picked me up and took me to the Otahu way station, and it was coming on daybreak. It was a bit foggy. I drove up the ramp, and me being smart, the West Coast Mirrors, I was able to keep the driver's side out on the grass, and the other side was on the weighbridge. So when the cop turned on the lights and tapped the scale on the weighbridge, and he kept tapping it to think that, he said, I'm sure it's heavier than that. But what he didn't know is he only had half the trailer because the other half was on the grass. So after he tapped all that, I said, I think I better get going, I'm okay. So I drove off and left him to it.
Because there was always a bit of a...
He only got half the weight, the other half was on the grass.
Yeah, exactly, and there's all sort of, I don't know, like good-humoured cat and mouse shenanigans with in those days, wasn't there,
Oh, it's true.
Yeah.
I think that I put it down to the fact that because you had to deal with the ministry so much and the permits and all that consternation of time, it was absolutely brutal to try and get permits. And the senior traffic police guys, they'd have their office girl in tears trying to give me a permit, and he'd be there gone away for a 2-hour lunch break, and he wouldn't have the permit signed. And taking a house to, say, Auckland, you used to go round to the North Shore, to Albany, you had to get a permit from Hamilton, and one from Papakura, one from Mount Roskill, where Keith Hay was, because he was difficult, and then we go round to, round onto Albany to... trying to think where it was. But anyhow, so you had 3 or 4 lots of permits that you had to get. And of course, when you had different cops that would come on through the night, of course you had this piece of paper with all these signatures on it, and it was just a nightmare.
What a nightmare.
Oh, absolute.
The International brand was a good brand for you?
Fantastic truck. It was an R200 ex-Air Force, and it had an 8V53. It was 237 horsepower, which was, in those days, we never had horsepower. Your trucks, the 6V53 Detroits that we had, they were only 195 horsepower. We ended up with Ross Todd with those when we changed we had a petrol to diesel. Ross Todd did 2, 3, 4, about 5 of those for me. And then we set up our own workshop in Rotorua, and we used to buy the trucks from Forest Products for £2,000, I suppose it was, maybe dollars, and we'd get rid of the back end for that sort of money. So we'd end up with a cab and a chassis, and then we'd buy 4 Detroits in one go from Clyde Engineering, and we'd set to build these trucks. And what happened, the Inland Revenue got a bit smart, and they started pushing me a little bit. So they came to our yard in Rotorua, and They asked all sorts of questions that you could well understand. And what was this and what was that? And of course I had an answer for all of them. And as the token that most truckies have got is what you call R&M. So that was repairs and maintenance. So I bluffed the guy with all the R&M and all the old motors that were laying there, but he didn't realise that we were actually building a new truck out of whatever. And of course I bought the million mile of diffs off Tids. And we built a magic truck.
The name Warwick Johnson House Removals is sort of in many ways, again touching on for people sort of in my era, there's two big R700 Macs that suddenly, so how did the Macs come about?
It goes back to 1973. I'd waltz on a bit, but we went to Australia to a truck show in there, and we went to a place called Toowoomba. And there was a guy at Toowoomba that had a fleet of 400 odd trucks. And in that workshop he was building the Leader, which is a truck that was homemade, you might say, with a cat motor, and was a very, very strong truck. In the days, 1973, nobody had any horsepower. The little R600 Mac was 237 horsepower. That was maximum. And these Caterpillar motors that they were doing was probably about the same. But this Cyril guy introduced us to this and that, and there was something like 30 or 40 of us there. And it was like a banquet meal with all the silver, and the meal was fantastic, and the guy was sure that we were going to buy some of his Leader trucks. But tucked in the corner was an R600 Mac from America, and it was sitting down in the dust, and one of us said, what's that truck doing down there? I suppose you could say to me, in my early days as a young fella carting the houses to Puriora, the Mack trucks they had in there were about 10 foot wide, and they didn't have a cab, but they were ex-military, and those two Mack trucks they had carting the logs gave me the history that if it was a Mack truck it was going to be good. So anyhow, Ron Carpenter was there, and this is history. Ron told me in later years that there was, out of say 40 or 50 of us, half of us that day signed up for an R600 Mac. So that put Motor Truck on the business of, and they imported this truck. I think it was $47,000 by then, 1973. So that was all right. So come time, and Ron Carpenter got cracking, and he started assembling trucks directly from the States. And of course the horsepower had gone up into 300, 375, and I went down there. I thought, well, I'm going to have a look at these Macs. I had some money in my pocket, and I thought, well, I'll at least get one. But when I got there, the guy that was doing the assembly work, I said, oh, you can walk through the workshop. No health and safety in those days. Anyhow, he said, there's those two Macs away over there parked up. He said, they've been there for a fair time. He said, nobody wants them. He said, they've got 44s. Well, I knew what he was talking about. The 44s are the size of the diff. And most truckies only wanted 39 because there was the extra weight, and weight was a problem. But for house removal, we never overweighted. A house is not heavy. But anyhow, I said, well, I'd be interested in one of those. So anyhow, the conversation went on. Well, he ended up with the price at £93,000. So in the delay and the discussion, the other truck was shivering and sitting there on its own, and I said, well, how about the other one? Can I have that too? So we negotiated a deal that was better than $93,000. So I ended up with two Mack trucks, and they were 375, absolutely brilliant. And we thought we were the king of the road, which we probably were at the time.
So they were like 375 V8s?
Yeah, V8s.
Yeah, and what did they have, the old 12-speed maxi torque in them?
They weren't favourable to the average truckie. They had a heating problem to do with the V8 part of the fact of it, but the fact that from a house removal point of view, we might only be 3 or 4 hours and we'd park up, and the motor, we weren't expecting to do 24 hours around the clock.
Yeah. But those two trucks were good for you?
Oh, we had them. The biggest mistake I made when I had them for 21 years. When I had them for 10 years, I should have got rid of them and got two new ones. But they were so reliable and regular, they were fantastic, and you could hook a bulldozer on and pull the hell out of them, or front bumpers were strong enough to do what you wanted. You couldn't kill them. They were absolutely outstanding, and in that time I had several Macs, and I think I've added up, I've had about 10 of them in my time.
Oh, and they're all been good trucks to you?
Oh, fantastic. They were outstanding.
Another couple of trucks that I want to talk to you about, and I've had a couple of people who knew I was coming to talk to you, asked me to ask about the Nissan Diesel TW52As. How were they to you? Were they good?
That happened. It was round about 1984, and again, a group of us went to Japan, and the idea was that I was interested in a Nissan truck. The Nissan people actually shouted us a deal. So we go there, and yes, here's the Nissan here. Yeah, I want one of those. I want two of them. So I bought two of them, and they were 6x4. I actually wanted a 6x6, and they had the 6x6 on the chain line building them, but they were all going to Africa, and they wouldn't talk to me about a six-wheel drive. So I got the Nissans as they were. I could say to you now, those Nissans were absolutely brilliant. You put the two trucks side by side, because we had a lot of trucks with winches on. We probably had about 10 Internationals and other trucks with winches, and we set these two Nissans up with winches and whatever. And if you were stuck in the mud with a 190 with the mud, the Nissans would actually walk past them in the mud. Whatever magic was in the back end of those Nissans, I'll never know. But they were just an outstanding truck.
And they were what, 350 horse or 350?
330 horsepower.
330 horsepower.
And they had a Road Ranger gearbox. If you never used a Road Ranger and used to the twin stick, you had a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
You had to learn to whatever.
Yeah.
But they were all right. I tried to give them to my guys that worked for me on a labour-only basis, but they didn't realise the gem that I was trying to do for them. And I ended up with one of them out of the scrap heap, and I rebuilt it and spent a fortune on it. And the history of that truck has gone to Fiji, and I put a new cab on it, and I virtually gave it away.
Really interested in the holistic vehicle, the truck, the trailer, and the engineering of both.
As my wife said, you're married to your bloody truck. She wasn't very happy about me, and it caused a few problems, I might say. I never realised the importance of it, but people used to always say, Warwick, listen, hey, you've got to write a book. I took on board the opportunity to write a book, and that's how it happened. And I never ever believed that it was going to be history. And I can boast to you now, that's 70 years, 1948 to 1988, if you add that up, that's quite a few years. My brain is so ticking away like talking to you now, and I wish I had another 30 years, I'd sort of do something more about it. But the trucking industry is on a paramount of fantastic opportunities, and where I live here now at T-Rail, they come through the town with 50 tonne on, they don't even change gear, up and over and through the hill and underneath the subway, and they're gone.
Warwick, you're very proud of your involvement in the New Zealand Heavy Haulage Association. Tell us how that all got started.
That was an interesting story, because being Peterkin and being me, and I suppose you could say that the house removal industry badly needed an organisation. We badly needed a representation within the unit. So anyhow, Waikato Heavy Haulage, this goes back to George Scotty. And I said to him, how about I come with you to your Wairaki, to your AGM for your heavy haulage? And so me being me, I ended up with Scotty, and I'm sitting there with all these guys all smartly dressed with their ties, and they had a pretty unique sort of an outfit that was like the gentleman's club. And here I was, just in an old pair of clothes with no tie on, sitting there listening to what they're going on about. And I actually said that, because I'd been to America and I'd witnessed the heavy haulage in America, it's all done by building removal people, because they're clever, must I say. So anyhow, I was able to tell these guys that anything over 3 or 4 metres wide, they couldn't handle it, they were scared of it. And I said, well, why don't we sort of bring our house removal guys, and we could create a better association, we could do something about it. Richard Hyde, he was quite a snappy little fella, and he sort of chiselled me a bit, and Trevor Jones was down the other end of the room, and they were arguing about things, and in the end I sort of won the day, and they said, well, in that case we're going to have a logo. And I said, so there again, these two guys were arguing whether it was a Kenworth or a Mack or a Peterbilt, and I said, well, you don't need that, all you need is a trailer, a house removal trailer. And one of them said, well, you're a smart bugger. I said, I know that. So anyhow, they put it to me. They said, the next meeting you can come, but bring your ideas. So, of course, I did that. And what they didn't know, that working for me was Robin, his wife was was a graphic artist for the Waikato Times. Anyhow, I said to Robin, how about we talk to your wife about this is what I want to do. We've got to want to put this is how we want to do it. So I drew it out. So she came up and we sort of sat down side by side, and the deal came with this hydraulic trailer. And what you've got to do now, you've done such a good job, let's put a bit of red on it like lipstick, because it's all female oriented, so the drawing's got red on which is the lipstick. I tabled it at the next meeting, and of course it was unanimous, it was accepted. I suppose I stirred the tripe in that day, and they say that within probably the next 12 months we had a membership equal to way beyond these 5 or 7 guys that were smartly dressed, a whole heap of hobo house removal guys all sitting around a room we were setting up a deal between us. And I told them, I said, you guys will melt away into the system, which did happen, and consequently we've got a fantastic membership with the New Zealand Heavy Haulage, and I'm pretty proud of that.
Proceeds of the book are going to St John's?
That's right. I've been talking to my Heavenly Father, and he doesn't want me to take a heap of money with me, so I've got $1 or $2 to one side, and my idea to support St John's. And I think on the highway today, the St John's people struggle to survive. The fire department have got fire and rescue written on their vehicles. What St John's get 72% from the crazy government, and they've got to inherit the other by donations for people. So within my book, I've dedicated an ambulance, and that's going to be part of me. I'm very happy about that.
So that's another fantastic reason to grab yourself a copy of the book, that the proceeds of what the book makes will go to really saving lives through the St John's.
Yeah, the people of St John's, a lot of those people are volunteers, and day to day they've got ambulances parked up when they haven't got the staff.
Yeah.
And the volunteers are not being paid. The stupid government of today don't recognise they're spending it on silly damn things, building, like they tried to build that cycle track underneath the Harbour Bridge. But if they could support St John's, and even if they gave them another 10%.
So you're also a great believer, and nowadays you don't think that young people can get close enough to the action.
I feel sorry for them. The industry's got to take, I don't care who you are, we've got to take on board the young people. And look at me, at my age, when I was 16, I was driving a Chev truck with a load of sand on it, that the traffic cop of the day, which was the local council, for 2 years he said, I've been watching you, but I never had an accident. I've never ever had an accident. The young people of today have got to have a chance. They've got to walk in and lean. They're not allowed to even travel in the truck and learn how to handle horsepower, how to take your foot off the brake, and how to drive without using your brakes. And and even in the building industry it's the same. And the younger people today, we've got to give them a chance. And if we don't, already we're short of truck drivers. You go to some of the local carriers and you say, well, what's all those 10 or 12 trucks? Oh, we haven't got any drivers.
After reading the book and going through it, and what I took out of the book is, you say in the book that, there was a little bit of ego on your part for the things that you took on, and did it so humbly. Like, you always involved people, and you always made it a venture.
Yeah, I think that. I think I've ended up with enough money to have my own house, but other than that, forget it. I think it goes right back to my grandfather, and I watched him, and he suffered terribly, and he got diabetes and lost his eyesight. In fact, he lost his eyesight. He was still shifting houses. And I felt for him, and I think I used that inference with Pop, that whatever we did in our life with men and people that worked for you, they had to be equal. We all had to be shared the same impact of. We go back to those years when I probably first started on my own. I couldn't have done it on my own, and I had 3 or 4 guys. We're all the same age. We all thought the same. We all shared each other's time. They all got paid. I never had any money. I was always an overdraft. I was dedicated in the industry of trying to improve the welfare. When you look at it now and see the activity of the house movers throughout New Zealand, I suppose you could say I sowed the seed way back, and I never realised that what we were doing was entering into the book of history, like the time I went down to Fred Willis and gave him a set of jacks, and I said we're going to shift the house, 5 houses, one each day, and how the opposition came along, and I sort of stalled them because I wanted to help Fred and make sure that it was a success, and by being a success, it radiated from him, and it bellowed its way back up through the South Island, and it goes on. Yeah, I'm very proud of what we've done.
What happened to Warwick Johnson House Removals in the end? Did you sell out, or?
I still own the company. I tried to dissolve it. My accountant said, no, I've given Diane the reins and she takes away any bills and debts because I don't understand the www.co and all my checkbooks are still in the drawer. You can have all them.
Yeah.
Well, I've given the company to Diane. She'd become a shareholder or a director. And my passing, which will be in a day or two, here's an interesting thing. I've even down in the yard in my office here, I've even got my own coffin leaning up against the wall. I've saved probably about $10,000 on having a coffin built. So, and the company paid for that.
Warwick Johnson, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit here this afternoon for a couple of hours and promote the book and share the stories. The book, as we've said, is called Prime Mover, The Remarkable Life of Warwick Johnson. It's an absolute must-read if you're a New Zealand trucking buff. And I think I'll give you the rest of the afternoon off, mate. You can go and do whatever you like now. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you. And my brain is still going round in circles, but I sort of live with the industry. I can't. That's part of me. It'll never change.
And just a reminder, Warwick's book, Prime Mover, is for sale at nztrucking.co.nz /shop. Enjoy.